The envelope trembled in Sarah Chen's hands like a dying butterfly, its edges worn soft from 3 weeks of careful handling. Inside her cramped studio apartment, the radiator clanged its familiar protest against the October chill. But she barely heard it anymore. Her fingers traced the lottery commission's embossed seal for the 100th time, the raised gold catching the amber light from her single floor lamp. $27 million. The number still felt like fiction written in someone else's handwriting. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She hadn't told anyone the full truth. Not her brother Mo, not her sister-in-law Priya, not even her nephew Jake, who called her Aunt Sassy and still believed she could fix anything with a Band-Aid and a chocolate chip cookie. They knew about the ticket. She'd made the mistake of mentioning she'd won something during last Sunday's family dinner, her voice barely a whisper above the clatter of Priya's good china. But the amount? That secret lived in her chest like a held breath, growing heavier each day. The thing about secrets is they change shape in the dark. What had started as caution, a sensible woman's instinct to protect her windfall from well-meaning family members with their own financial storms, had transformed into something else entirely. Fear, maybe, or wisdom disguised as fear. Sarah had watched too many lottery documentaries, read too many horror stories about families torn apart by sudden wealth. Money didn't just change bank account numbers, it rewrote relationships with invisible ink. Her phone buzzed against the scratched surface of her thrift store coffee table. Mo's name flashed across the cracked screen, and she felt that familiar knot form between her shoulder blades. Mo had a way of calling at precisely the wrong moments, as if he possessed some supernatural radar for her most vulnerable states. She let it ring 3 times before answering, using those precious seconds to arrange her voice into something casual and unassuming. "Hey, Mo." She tucked her legs beneath her on the second-hand couch, the springs creaking in protest. Through her third-floor window, she could see Mrs. Patterson from 2B walking her ancient poodle under the streetlight, the same route they'd taken every evening for the past 4 years. Some routines never changed, no matter how much the world shifted around them. "Sarah, thank God!" Mo's voice carried that edge she'd learned to recognize in childhood, the tone that meant he needed something, but hadn't quite figured out how to ask for it yet. "I was hoping we could talk. Are you free tomorrow evening? Maybe we could grab dinner at that Thai place you like on Henderson Street." The Thai place, where pad Thai cost $12, and she usually ordered water instead of the mango lassi she craved, because every dollar counted when you worked part-time at the community center and lived paycheck to paycheck. Had lived paycheck to paycheck. The present tense felt strange now, like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. "Sure," she said, though something in his voice made her stomach flutter with anxiety. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine." The words came too quickly, tumbling over each other in their haste to sound convincing. "It's just, well, we have some news. Good news, actually, but I'd rather tell you in person." After they hung up, Sarah remained curled on her couch, staring at the lottery envelope propped against her ancient television set. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had creeped inward while she wasn't looking. She'd bought this place with her ex-husband David 3 years before their divorce, back when they'd believed in shared dreams and matching coffee mugs. Now it held only her ghosts and her secrets, along with furniture that told the story of a life rebuilt from scratch. The lottery ticket itself lived in her bedroom safe, nestled between her passport and her grandmother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing she'd inherited when Nai passed 2 years ago. Every morning, Sarah would check to make sure it was still there, as if $20 million might simply evaporate if she didn't maintain constant vigilance. The numbers were burned into her memory. 07, 14, 23, 31, 45, Powerball 18. Her birthday? David's birthday, a habit she still couldn't break. The date they'd adopted their cat Whiskers from the shelter, the year she'd graduated college, and 2 random numbers that had simply felt right when she'd filled out the playslip at Murphy's Corner Store. She'd been buying the same numbers for 3 years, every Tuesday and Friday, a $5 ritual that felt more like meditation than gambling. Sometimes she'd joke with Murphy, the store's ancient owner, about what she'd do when she finally won. travel to Ireland to see the village where her great-grandmother was born, open a community center for kids who needed after-school programs, buy a house with a garden where she could grow tomatoes and basil, and maybe learn to be happy again. The irony wasn't lost on her that the win had come during the hardest month of her adult life. Her hours at the community center had been cut due to budget constraints, her car had needed $800 in repairs she couldn't afford, and her landlord had mentioned, casually, cruelly, that rent would be increasing in January. She'd been researching second jobs, contemplating a move to a cheaper apartment, maybe even leaving the city that had been her home for 15 years. And then Murphy had called her name as she was walking out of the store, waving the scanner over her crumpled ticket with the kind of bemused expression that suggested he'd seen this moment 1,000 times before. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Looks like you got yourself a winner here, Sarah girl." But not just any winner. The winner. The jackpot that had been rolling over for 8 weeks, growing larger and more impossible with each drawing until it had reached the kind of number that made headlines and changed lives and scared the hell out of sensible women who'd spent their adult years learning to live small and careful and safe. Sarah walked to her bedroom window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Below, the neighborhood hummed with its usual evening rhythm. Teenagers gathering under the broken streetlight by the bus stop, sharing secrets and cigarettes. The sound of salsa music drifting from the Martinez family's first-floor apartment. The distant rumble of the 9:47 train carrying commuters home to lives she could now afford to live anywhere she chose. But where was home when you could suddenly afford any home? The question had been keeping her awake for 3 weeks, joining the chorus of other impossible decisions that seemed to multiply in the dark hours before dawn. Should she quit her job immediately, or maintain the pretense of normal life a while longer? Should she hire a financial advisor, a lawyer, a bodyguard? Should she move somewhere no one knew her name, or stay and try to preserve the relationships that had anchored her through the worst years of her life? And always, threading through every other consideration, what to tell Mo. Her brother had been her protector once, back when they were children and the world seemed divided into simple categories of safe and dangerous, fair and unfair, family and everyone else. Mo was 3 years older, tall enough to reach the high shelves in their mother's kitchen, brave enough to kill the spiders that sent Sarah screaming from the bathroom. He'd taught her to ride a bike in the parking lot behind their elementary school, running alongside her with one steady hand on the seat until the moment he let go and she discovered she'd been flying solo for longer than she'd realized. But somewhere between childhood and adulthood, their roles had shifted. Mo had married Priya straight out of college and immediately began accumulating the kind of responsibilities that seemed to multiply like rabbits. A mortgage on a house, slightly too expensive for their combined salaries, 2 car payments, credit card debt that grew and shrank in mysterious cycles, and Jake, beautiful, complicated Jake, who had been diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia and needed tutoring and medication and a dozen other interventions that insurance covered partially or not at all. Sarah had become the one they called during emergencies, the single sister with no dependents and presumably more flexibility, more spare resources, more room in her life for other people's crises. She'd lent them money for Jake's tutoring, for Priya's emergency dental work, for the deposit on their current apartment when they'd been forced to move suddenly after Mo lost his job at the marketing firm. Small amounts usually, $300 here, $500 there. There. Numbers that stretched her own budget but seemed manageable in the context of family loyalty and love. The problem was that Lent had become a euphemism. None of the money had ever been repaid, not because Mo and Priya were malicious or ungrateful, but because their financial boat always seemed to be taking on water faster than they could bail it out. Sarah had stopped mentioning the loans, had learned to think of them as gifts she'd given freely, without expectation of return. It was easier than watching Mo's face crumple with shame every time she asked about repayment. But $27 million changed the mathematics of generosity. It transformed her from the helpful sister with a few spare hundreds into someone who could solve every problem Mo and Priya had ever faced, with enough left over to solve problems for generations of their descendants. The thought was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Priya. "So excited to see you tomorrow. Mo's been bouncing off the walls all day. Thank you for being such an amazing sister. Heart." Sarah stared at the heart emoji until it blurred. Amazing sister. If only Priya knew how unamazing her thoughts had been lately, how many nights she'd lain awake wondering if $27 million was enough to disappear entirely, to become someone new in a place where no one knew about her failed marriage or her struggling family or her history of making herself smaller so other people could feel larger. She walked to her kitchen and put the kettle on for tea, a ritual that usually calmed her racing thoughts. But tonight, even the familiar routine felt loaded with significance. The kettle was 10 years old, a wedding gift that had somehow survived the divorce. Should she replace it with something expensive and gleaming, or keep it as a reminder of who she used to be? How did you navigate the transition from careful spending to unlimited resources without losing yourself in the process? The Lottery Commission had given her the standard advice: hire professionals, avoid major decisions for at least 6 months, and tell as few people as possible until she had a plan. But they hadn't explained how to sleep at night when your entire understanding of possibility had been rewritten in a single moment. They hadn't mentioned how exhausting it was to maintain normal conversations about weather and work schedules when your head was full of numbers too large to comprehend. Outside, she heard the familiar sound of Mrs. Patterson's key in the front door lock, followed by the click of the poodle's nails on the lobby's tile floor. By now, Mrs. Patterson would be checking her mailbox, sorting through bills and advertisements with the same methodical attention she brought to every aspect of her carefully ordered life. Sarah envied that simplicity, the comfort of routines that remained unchanged by external forces. Tomorrow, she would see Mo and Priya and Jake. She would sit across from them at the Thai restaurant, order her usual pad thai and water, and try to read the subtext behind their excitement. Whatever news they had to share, whatever favor they needed to ask, she now had the power to say yes, without question or consequence. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy with implications she was still learning to understand. The kettle's whistle pierced the quiet apartment, sharp and insistent. Sarah poured hot water over her tea bag and watched the amber liquid swirl and deepen, thinking about the strange mathematics of secrets and the weight of words unspoken. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. But tonight, she would sit with her tea and her envelope and the growing certainty that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. The only question was whether she would have any say in the direction of that change, or if $27 million came with its own momentum, carrying her toward a future she'd never chosen but could no longer avoid. The lottery ticket in her bedroom safe would still be there in the morning, patient and permanent as a promise. But the woman who checked on it each day was already becoming someone else, shaped by possibilities that felt as vast and terrifying as the space between stars.
Sarah's alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., the same time it had buzzed every weekday for the past 4 years. Muscle memory guided her through the morning routine: shower, coffee, toast with peanut butter, a quick check of the weather app before selecting clothes from her carefully organized closet. But today, each familiar action felt like performance art, as if she were playing the role of her former self for an audience of one. She caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror as she brushed her teeth and paused, searching her face for signs of transformation. Shouldn't $27 million leave some visible mark? Change the shape of her nose or the color of her eyes, or at least smooth away the worry lines that had appeared during the divorce proceedings. But the face staring back at her was disappointingly ordinary. Brown eyes, still flecked with gold, shoulder-length black hair that refused to hold a curl, the small scar on her chin from a childhood bicycle accident that Mo had felt guilty about for months afterward. At the community center, Sarah unlocked the front door at exactly 7:45 a.m. and flipped on the fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered before settling into their harsh institutional glow. The building smelled like disinfectant and hope in equal measure, a scent she'd grown to love over her 5 years working here. The lobby walls were covered with children's artwork, crayon drawings of families and houses and dogs that somehow managed to capture joy more effectively than any expensive painting she could now afford to buy. "Morning, sunshine." Marcus Johnson emerged from the supply closet with an armload of construction paper, his maintenance coveralls already dusty despite the early hour. Marcus had been working at the center for 12 years, longer than anyone except the director, Mrs. Chen, no relation despite the shared surname. He possessed an uncanny ability to fix anything broken, from temperamental copy machines to heartbroken teenagers, and had become Sarah's closest friend in the building. "Morning, Marcus." She hung her jacket on the hook behind the front desk and powered up the ancient computer that would take approximately 7 minutes to become functional. "How was your evening?" "Same as always. Takeout Thai food and a documentary about penguins." Marcus grinned, revealing the gap between his front teeth that made him look younger than his 43 years. "I'm living the dream, Chen. Pure excitement and glamour." Sarah smiled despite the churning in her stomach. Marcus had been ordering takeout from the same Thai restaurant where she'd be meeting Mo tonight, the one with the $12 pad Thai and the owner who always asked about his customers' families and accented English that carried the warmth of genuine interest. She wondered if Marcus had any secrets that kept him awake at night, any life-changing news that made small talk feel like walking through quicksand. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of controlled chaos. Children began arriving at 8:30 for the before-school program, their backpacks heavy with homework and dreams, their voices creating a symphony of excitement and complaint that filled the building with purpose. Sarah checked them in, mediated disputes over shared supplies, and helped Jake Henderson, not her nephew Jake, but another boy who'd been coming to the center since kindergarten, tie his shoes before the school bus arrived. "Miss Sarah." Jake Henderson tugged at her sweater as the other children lined up by the door. "My mom says we might have to move again soon, but I don't want to move. I like it here." Sarah knelt to his eye level, her heart contracting at the worry in his 8-year-old face. Jake's family had moved 3 times in the past 2 years, chasing cheaper rent and better opportunities that always seemed to evaporate just as they got settled. She'd watched him struggle to make new friends each time, to adjust to new schools and new routines while maintaining the kind of resilience that children shouldn't need to develop so young. "Whatever happens, you're going to be okay," she told him, meaning it in ways she couldn't explain. "And you know what? You can always call me, no matter where you move. I'll always want to hear about what you're doing and how you're feeling."
Jake nodded solemnly and joined the line of children heading toward the school bus. Sarah watched through the window as they climbed aboard, their small faces pressed against glass that reflected the morning sun like mirrors. In a different life, the life she'd been living just 3 weeks ago, Jake's potential move would have been another small heartbreak she absorbed and carried, another reminder of how little power she had to change the circumstances that shaped the children she cared about. But now she could buy Jake's family a house. She could pay their rent for years, could set up college funds for Jake and his little sister, could transform their lives with a generosity so complete it would erase every worry that currently kept his mother awake at night. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "You okay?" Marcus appeared at her elbow, his maintenance cart loaded with supplies for the morning's inevitable disasters. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just thinking about the kids," Sarah said, which was true enough to avoid being a complete lie. "Sometimes I wish I could do more for them, you know?" Marcus nodded, understanding implicit in his expression. They'd had this conversation before, usually during the quiet moments between programmed activities when the weight of what they couldn't fix seemed to press against the walls of what they could. "We do what we can with what we have," he said. The same response he'd given her dozens of times over the years. That's all anyone can do. Except it wasn't anymore. The equation had changed, had been rewritten in numbers so large they seemed to belong to someone else's life. Sarah excused herself and retreated to the small office she shared with two other part-time coordinators, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. The office contained 3 desks, 4 filing cabinets, and a window that looked out onto the center's playground, where teenagers gathered after school to flirt and argue and figure out who they were becoming. Sarah's desk was the one closest to the window, positioned so she could monitor the playground while completing the endless paperwork that community programs seemed to generate like weeds. She pulled out her phone and Googled lottery winner stories, a search she'd performed obsessively over the past 3 weeks. The results were always the same mixture of fairy tale endings and cautionary tales. Winners who'd used their money to start foundations and fund scholarships, winners who'd been sued by relatives and bankrupted by bad investments, winners who'd moved to private islands and never spoke to their families again. One story particularly haunted her: a woman in Michigan who'd won $18 million and tried to give most of it away to family members and friends. Within 5 years, she'd been divorced, estranged from her children, and living in a trailer park because she'd underestimated the tax implications of her generosity. The woman had given an interview to a local newspaper, and her words echoed in Sarah's mind. "I thought money would solve everyone's problems. I didn't realize it would create new ones." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor, Mrs. Rodriguez. "Can you stay until 7 tonight? Jamie called in sick, and we need coverage for the evening program." Any other day, Sarah would have said yes without hesitation. The evening program was her favorite part of the job. Older kids who came by choice rather than necessity, teenagers who trusted her enough to ask for advice about relationships and college applications, and parents who didn't understand why their grades mattered. But tonight, she was supposed to meet Mo and Priya, supposed to learn what news had made her brother bounce off the walls with excitement. She typed back, "Sorry, I have a family dinner tonight, but I can come in early tomorrow to help catch up on anything that needs doing." The response came immediately. "No problem. Hope you have a great time with your family. See you tomorrow." Sarah stared at the phone screen, guilt twisting in her stomach like a living thing. Mrs. Rodriguez had been nothing but kind to her, had worked around her schedule during the worst months of her divorce, had written her a glowing recommendation letter when she'd briefly considered looking for full-time work elsewhere. The woman deserved better than lies and fake emergencies from someone who could now afford to fund the entire community center for the next century. But how did you explain that you couldn't work late because you had to meet your brother for dinner to discuss news that might require you to navigate the treacherous waters of family financial dynamics while sitting on a secret that could reshape everyone's future? How did you maintain normal relationships when normal had become a foreign concept overnight? The lunch hour brought a new wave of children, elementary school kids, who attended the center's after-school program. Sarah helped them with homework, mediated disputes over board games, and supervised art projects that invariably resulted in more paint on clothing than on paper. The familiar chaos should have been comforting, but today every interaction felt weighted with significance she couldn't share. "Miss Sarah, look what I made!" 7-year-old Aisha bounded over with a painting that appeared to depict either a rainbow or an explosion. "It's a picture of what I want my house to look like when I grow up." Sarah studied the swirls of color with appropriate seriousness. "Tell me about it." "This part is pink because that's my favorite color, and this part is blue because that's my mom's favorite color, and this yellow part is where we'll keep all the food so we never run out." Aisha pointed to each section with paint-covered fingers. "And this green part is grass where I can have a dog. Mom says we can't have a dog in our apartment, but maybe someday we can live somewhere with grass."
The casual way children articulated their dreams always amazed Sarah. No hedge fund managers or financial advisors, no complex calculations about mortgage rates and property taxes, just the simple desire for pink walls in a yard big enough for a dog. She could make that happen for Aisha now, could write a check that would transform a child's crayon fantasy into reality. But should she? And if she helped one child, what about the others? The center served over 200 kids from families struggling with poverty, immigration status, job insecurity, and a dozen other challenges that money could address but not necessarily solve. How did you choose who to help when you had the power to help everyone, but lacked the wisdom to know whether help was always helpful? By 4 p.m., Sarah's head was pounding with the effort of maintaining normal conversation while her internal monologue spiraled through increasingly complex ethical calculations. She excused herself to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, staring at her reflection in the spotted mirror above the sink. "Get it together," she whispered to her reflection. "You're meeting your brother for dinner, not negotiating world peace." But the distinction felt less clear than it should have been. Family dinners had their own diplomatic complexities, especially when everyone brought their own agenda to the table. Sarah had learned to read the subtext in Mo's voice, the difference between casual calls and conversations that began with phrases like, "I was hoping we could talk," or "We have some news." Tonight's dinner had all the markers of a conversation that would require careful navigation. She returned to the main room and helped the children pack up their art projects and homework assignments. Marcus was mopping the floors with his usual methodical precision, whistling a tune she didn't recognize but found oddly comforting. The building would be clean and ready for tomorrow's chaos, the same cycle of preparation and mess and restoration that had shaped her working days for 5 years. "See you tomorrow, sunshine. Hope your evening is more exciting than penguins and takeout."
"I'll let you know," Sarah said, though she suspected excitement wasn't the right word for whatever awaited her at the Thai restaurant. Challenging, maybe. Complicated, definitely. But exciting suggested anticipation and joy, emotions that felt as foreign as the numbers on her lottery ticket. The walk from the community center to her apartment usually took 12 minutes and served as a buffer zone between her working self and her private self. But today, the boundary felt permeable, her worries and secrets bleeding from one context to the other like watercolors in rain. By the time she reached her building, Sarah felt exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with the children she'd supervised or the paperwork she'd completed. Mrs. Patterson was checking her mailbox in the lobby, her ancient poodle panting softly at her feet. "Good evening, dear," she said with the kind of genuine warmth that made Sarah want to cry. "How was your day?" "Good, thanks. How was yours?" "Oh, same as always. Doctor's appointment this morning, grocery shopping this afternoon, and now dinner with my stories on television." Mrs. Patterson smiled, her lined face creasing with contentment. Simple pleasures for simple people. Sarah nodded and headed for the stairs, Mrs. Patterson's words echoing in her mind. Simple pleasures for simple people. When had she stopped being simple? When had her pleasures become complicated by possibilities she'd never asked for and couldn't figure out how to handle? In her apartment, Sarah changed clothes 3 times before settling on dark jeans and a sweater that looked casual enough for a family dinner, but nice enough to suggest she'd made an effort. She checked her appearance in the full-length mirror attached to her closet door and practiced different expressions. Surprised, concerned, supportive, neutral. None of them looked convincing. At 6:15, she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. The lottery envelope remained propped against her television, silent and patient as a sleeping cat. Tomorrow, she would have to decide how much longer she could maintain this precarious balance between truth and omission, between the person she'd been and the person she was becoming. But tonight, she was still just Sarah Chen, the helpful sister who showed up when called, who listened more than she spoke, who absorbed other people's problems like a sponge absorbs water. The woman with $27 million could wait a few more hours. The evening air was crisped with the promise of winter, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter as she walked toward the restaurant where Mo and Priya were waiting with their news and their excitement
and their assumptions about who she was and what she could offer. The distance from her apartment to the Thai restaurant was only 8 blocks, but Sarah felt like she was walking toward an entirely different country, one where the rules she learned no longer applied, and the map she'd been following had been redrawn by forces beyond her control. The Thai Orchid restaurant buzzed with the comfortable chaos of weeknight dinner service, the air thick with the scent of lemongrass and chili oil. Sarah spotted Mo and Priya immediately. They were seated at their usual table by the window, the one that offered a view of the street but enough privacy for family conversations that might require tears or raised voices. Jake sat between them, coloring in a Disney activity book while stealing French fries from his father's plate with the casual audacity that only 8-year-olds could manage. "Aunt Sassy!" Jake's face lit up as Sarah approached, and he launched himself from his chair into her arms with the kind of unreserved affection that made her chest ache with love and longing. This was why she'd kept the secret, she reminded herself, to protect moments like this from becoming complicated by dollar signs and expectations and the strange mathematics of sudden wealth. "Hey, buddy!" She hugged him tight, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo and the faint smell of playground sand that seemed to cling to him regardless of how many times Priya scrubbed his hands. "How was school today?"
We learned about the water cycle, and Mrs. Peterson said my drawing of evaporation was the best in the class. Jake wiggled back into his chair and held up his coloring book. "Look, I'm making this castle purple because regular castles are boring." "Purple castles are definitely cooler," Sarah agreed, settling into the chair across from Mo. Her brother looked good. Better than he had in months, actually. His face had lost the tight, worried expression that had become his default since losing his marketing job 18 months ago. Even his posture seemed more relaxed, shoulders no longer hunched against invisible blows. "You look happy," Sarah observed, accepting the menu that Priya handed her even though she'd memorized it years ago. "Both of you do." Priya practically glowed, her dark eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "We have incredible news," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze Sarah's hand. "But what if it doesn't?" Sarah pressed, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "What if something goes wrong? What if the company fails, or Raj's timeline gets delayed, or we figure it out?" Mo interrupted, but his confidence was starting to show cracks around the edges. "We always figure it out." Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to grab her brother by the shoulders and shake him until he understood that 23% interest on $5,000 would compound into a nightmare if Raja's promised returns didn't materialize. She wanted to tell him that she could solve this problem with a single phone call, that $27 million made $5,000 seem like pocket change, and that he'd never have to worry about money again if she just opened her mouth and shared her secret. But she also wanted to protect him from becoming the kind of person who saw his sister as a solution to every financial problem. She'd watched lottery documentaries where family members became entitled and demanding, where relationships dissolved under the weight of expectations and resentment. Mo was a good man who'd made a terrible decision, based on assumptions about her generosity and his own desperation. But he was still her brother, still the person who'd taught her to ride a bike and killed her bathroom spiders and loved her unconditionally even when she'd divorced David and moved into a crappy apartment and stopped believing in happy endings. "How much will you owe if you can't pay it back in time?" she asked quietly. Priya and Mo exchanged a look that contained entire conversations about money and stress and the kind of calculations that kept parents awake at night. "The minimum payment is about $200 a month, but that's mostly interest. It would take forever to pay off the principal that way." Forever, in credit card terms, meant years of payments that would strain their already tight budget, years of Mo working whatever jobs he could find, while Priya stretched their income to cover Jake's needs and their basic expenses. Sarah had watched them navigate financial crises before, had seen how money stress affected every aspect of their lives, their marriage, their parenting, their ability to enjoy simple pleasures without calculating the cost. The server returned to refill their rice bowls and check on their meal, her practiced smile faltering slightly when she noticed the tension at their table. Sarah managed to thank her and request more napkins, grateful for the moment of normalcy in a conversation that felt like navigating a minefield. "The thing is," Mo said, after Nim had moved on to another table, "we were hoping you might be able to help us with the monthly payments if Raj's timeline gets delayed. just until the investment pays off. We wouldn't ask for the full amount, maybe just half of each payment, enough to keep us from falling behind. $100 a month. That's what her brother was asking for, a sum that seemed absurdly small given the numbers that had been living in her head for 3 weeks. Sarah spent more than that on groceries each month, had probably paid that much in late fees and banking charges over the years without giving it serious thought. For someone with $27 million, agreeing to help with the credit card payments should have been as automatic as breathing.
But the precedent terrified her. If she said yes to this request, how could she say no to the next one? And there would be a next one. There always was with Mo and Priya. Not because they were greedy or manipulative, but because their lives seemed to generate financial emergencies with the regularity of seasons. Jake would need something for school, or their car would break down, or their rent would increase, or Priya would need medical treatment that insurance didn't cover. Each crisis would be legitimate and urgent and solvable with money Sarah now had in abundance. "I need to think about it," she said, hating the way Mo's face fell at her non-answer. "The thing is, I haven't actually received my lottery money yet. There's paperwork and processing times and a bunch of bureaucratic stuff I'm still figuring out." This was technically true. She'd only received confirmation of her win, not the actual payout. But it was also a deflection, a way of buying time while she tried to figure out how to navigate the impossible terrain between honesty and kindness. "Of course," Priya said quickly, "we don't want you to promise anything you can't deliver. It's just, well, it would be such a relief to know we had a backup plan if things don't work out with Raj." Jake had finished coloring his castle and was now working on what appeared to be a dragon, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to stay within the lines. "Aunt Sassy, do you think dragons are real?" "I think they're real in all the ways that matter," Sarah said, grateful for his innocence and the temporary distraction it provided. "What do you think?" "I think they're real, but they're invisible so grown-ups can't see them. Only kids can see them because we still believe in magic." Mo smiled at his son with the kind of love that made my heart ache. Whatever financial mistakes he'd made, whatever poor decisions lay in his past and future, Mo was a devoted father who would do anything to protect Jake from the harsh realities that shaped adult life. The cash advance wasn't just about greed or poor planning. It was about hope, about believing that maybe this time the risk would pay off and his family could stop living paycheck to paycheck. "You know what, buddy?" Sarah said, making a decision that felt both right and terrifying. "I think your dad sees dragons too. He just calls them opportunities." Mo's laugh was rueful but genuine. "Your aunt is very wise, Jake. Maybe too wise for her own good." They finished dinner with conversation that danced around the edges of money and stress and the unspoken questions that hung between them like smoke. Jake told them about his upcoming school play, where he'd been cast as a tree, and Priya shared gossip about her coworkers at the dental office where she worked part-time as a receptionist. Mo talked about a promising job interview he had scheduled for next week, his voice carrying the forced optimism of someone who'd learned not to count on good news until it was signed and dated. When the check came, Mo reached for his wallet with the automatic gesture of someone who'd been raised to pay for family dinners, but Sarah intercepted the leather folder before he could open it, sliding her credit card inside with practiced efficiency. "I've got this," she said, ignoring Mo's protest. "It's the least I can do." The phrase felt loaded with significance she couldn't explain. Literally, buying dinner was the least she could do. She could also pay off their credit card debt, buy them a house, set up college funds for Jake, eliminate every source of financial stress that currently shaped their daily decisions. But the least she could do was also the most she felt capable of doing without fundamentally altering the dynamics of their relationship in ways none of them were prepared to handle. Outside the restaurant, they hugged goodbye with the slightly awkward intensity of people who shared difficult truths and weren't sure how to process them. Jake clung to Sarah's legs like a koala, and she bent down to his level for a proper hug that smelled like crayons and possibility. "Promise you'll come to my school play," he said solemnly. "It's next Friday at 7 o'clock, and I'm going to be the best tree anyone's ever seen."
I wouldn't miss it for the world, Sarah promised, and meant it in ways that surprised her. Whatever else was happening in her life, whatever decisions she needed to make about money and family and the future, she would be there to watch Jake play a tree with the dedication that only 8-year-olds brought to their art. Mo walked her to her car, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets against the evening chill. "I'm sorry if we put you in an awkward position tonight," he said quietly. We're scared, you know? It feels like we're always one emergency away from losing everything." Sarah's heart broke a little at the vulnerability in his voice. This was the brother she remembered from childhood, the one who'd admitted when he was afraid of the dark or nervous about starting middle school. Money stress had a way of making people desperate and defensive, but underneath Mo's poor financial decisions was a good man trying to build a stable life for his family. "You don't have to apologize," she said. "I understand why you did what you did. I just wish you'd talked to me first." "I know. We should have. It's just that when Raj called with the deadline, it felt like we had to act fast or miss out completely." Mo kicked at a piece of gravel, his expression troubled. "Do you think we made a mistake?" The honest answer was yes, absolutely. Taking out a cash advance at 23% interest to invest in a relative startup was exactly the kind of decision that financial advisors warned people against in strong, bold letters. But Mo didn't need brutal honesty right now. He needed support and hope and the reassurance that his family would be okay regardless of how Raj's investment played out. "I think you made the best decision you could with the information you had," Sarah said carefully, "and I think everything's going to work out fine." Mo's smile was grateful and relieved, and Sarah felt the weight of her own deception settle more heavily on her shoulders. Everything would work out fine, but not because Raj's investment would pay off or because Mo would find a job that paid enough to handle their expenses, plus credit card payments. Everything would work out fine because Sarah Chen had won $27 million and was slowly learning that having the power to solve every problem didn't make the solutions any clearer. After Mo left, Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, staring at the Thai Orchid's neon sign and trying to process what had just happened. Her family needed help, not the dramatic, life-or-death kind of help that made for compelling movies, but the grinding, daily kind of help that shaped real people's lives in quiet, persistent ways. They needed help with credit card payments and job searches and the 1,000 small expenses that could derail a budget and destroy a family's sense of security. And she could help them. She could do more than help them. She could transform their lives so completely that money would never be a source of stress again. But she could also destroy something precious in the process, something fragile and irreplaceable about the way they related to each other, as equals, as siblings who'd grown up in the same house and shared the same childhood fears and dreams. The drive home took her through neighborhoods that represented different economic realities. The struggling area where she lived, with its mix of working families and young professionals stretching their budgets as far as possible. The middle-class section where Mo and Priya rented their apartment, with its tree-lined streets and decent schools, and the kind of stability that always seemed just slightly out of reach. And the wealthy district near the reservoir, where houses sold for more than most people earn in a lifetime, and financial security was taken for granted. Soon, Sarah could live anywhere she chose. She could buy a house in the wealthy district, could afford private schools for Jake, could ensure that her family never had to worry about money again. But the question that haunted her as she drove through the quiet streets was whether solving their financial problems would create other kinds of problems that money couldn't fix. Back in her apartment, Sarah made a cup of tea and sat on her couch with her laptop, researching everything she could find about family dynamics and sudden wealth. The internet was full of advice about managing financial windfalls, but most of it focused on practical considerations like taxes and investments and estate planning. Very little addressed the emotional complexity of maintaining relationships when the balance of power shifted so dramatically and so suddenly. One article particularly resonated with her,
a piece written by a therapist who specialized in working with lottery winners and their families. Money doesn't solve relationship problems, the therapist had written. It amplifies them. Families that communicate well and trust each other tend to navigate financial windfalls successfully. Families with existing patterns of dysfunction often find that money makes their problems worse, not better. Sarah wasn't sure which category her family fell into. She and Mo had always been close, but their relationship had been shaped by certain assumptions about their respective roles and capabilities. She was the responsible single sister who could be counted on for help during emergencies. He was the struggling father who worked hard but couldn't quite get ahead no matter how much effort he put in. Those roles had defined their interactions for years, creating a dynamic that felt comfortable and predictable even when it wasn't entirely fair. What happened when the responsible sister suddenly had enough money to solve every problem permanently? What happened when the struggling father no longer needed to struggle? Sarah wasn't sure either of them knew how to be different people within their relationship, and she wasn't sure they should have to learn. Her phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "Thank you for dinner and for listening tonight. I know this is a lot to process, and we appreciate you considering helping us. Whatever you decide, we love you." Sarah stared at the heart emoji until it blurred, thinking about love and money and the complicated mathematics of family obligation. She loved Mo and Priya and Jake more than she could articulate, loved them enough to want to protect them from financial stress, and also enough to want to protect them from the potential consequences of her generosity. The lottery ticket in her bedroom safe held the power to change everything or nothing, depending on choices she hadn't figured out how to make. But tonight, sitting in her small apartment with her tea and her secrets, and her growing understanding of how little wisdom came automatically with wealth, Sarah felt more lost than she had since the day she'd first scratched off the silver coating and seen those impossible numbers. Tomorrow she would have to decide how much longer she could maintain this balance between truth and kindness, between the sister she'd always been and the person she was becoming. But tonight, she would sit with the weight of other people's hope and her own fear, trying to figure out how to be generous without being destructive, how to help without creating harm. The evening news played softly in the background, stories about politicians and weather and all the daily dramas that shaped other people's lives. But Sarah barely heard it. Her world had narrowed to the space between what she could do and what she should do, between the promise of $27 million and the price of keeping it secret. Outside her window, the neighborhood settled into its nighttime rhythm, and Sarah Chen sat alone with her impossible choices, wondering if having every answer was just another way of having no answers at all.
By 5 a.m., she'd made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She couldn't let her brother sink deeper into debt based on assumptions about her ability to help. And she couldn't continue lying about her situation while watching him make increasingly desperate choices. The mathematics were simple, even if the emotions were complex. Mo needed to know the truth about her lottery win, and she needed to know the truth about Raj's investment opportunity. Sarah made coffee and opened her laptop, beginning what would become 6 hours of intensive research into Raj Patel, sustainable packaging startups, and the technology sector's recent acquisition trends. What she discovered made her stomach clench with anxiety and anger in equal measure. Raj's LinkedIn profile looked impressive at first glance. 15 years in tech, positions at 3 different companies, glowing recommendations from former colleagues. But deeper investigation revealed a pattern that set off every alarm bell Sarah had learned to recognize during her years working with families in crisis. Raj had been laid off from his last 2 positions, had started and abandoned 2 previous ventures that had failed to secure funding, and was currently involved in what appeared to be his 3rd attempt at entrepreneurship in 5 years. The sustainable packaging company, Green Wrap Solutions, had an amateurish website, no verifiable customer base, and incorporation papers filed just 8 months ago. Their revolutionary technology was described in vague terms that sounded impressive, but conveyed no specific information about actual innovation or market viability. Most damning of all, Sarah found no evidence of any acquisition by a major corporation, despite Raj's claims about a recent buyout. What she did find was a pattern of social media posts where Raj solicited investments from friends and family members, each time promising guaranteed returns and limited time opportunities. The language was almost identical to what Mo had described, down to phrases like revolutionary technology and triple your investment minimum. Sarah's hands shook as she printed out screenshots and documentation, building a file that painted an increasingly clear picture of financial fraud. Raj wasn't just a failed entrepreneur making overly optimistic promises. He was someone systematically targeting people who trusted him, exploiting family relationships and friendship networks to fund a lifestyle his actual income couldn't support. At 11 a.m., she called in sick to work and drove to Mo and Priya's apartment complex, a collection of 2-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard where children played and teenagers gathered to avoid whatever was happening inside their homes. She'd visited countless times over the years, but today the familiar setting felt charged with significance, as if she were seeing it through different eyes. Mo answered the door in his pajamas, his hair standing up in directions that suggested he'd slept as poorly as she had. "Sarah, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at work?" "We need to talk," she said, holding up the folder of documentation she'd compiled. "All of us. Is Priya here?" Priya emerged from the kitchen wearing scrubs. She had a shift at the dental office starting at noon, and her expression shifted from surprise to concern as she registered Sarah's serious tone. "What's wrong? You look like someone died." "In a way, someone did," she said grimly. "Can we sit down? This is going to take a while." They gathered around the dining room table that doubled as Jake's homework station and Priya's bill-paying headquarters. Sarah spread out her research like a detective presenting evidence, watching her brother's face change as she processed the implications of what she'd discovered. "I don't understand," Mo said after she'd walked them through Raj's history and the lack of evidence for any acquisition. "He's family. He wouldn't lie to us about something this important."
He's not technically family, Priya said quietly, her voice getting smaller as she studied the printouts. "He's my cousin's husband's brother. I've only met him 3 times, and one of those was at our wedding 8 years ago." Sarah felt a familiar combination of sympathy and frustration as she watched Mo grapple with the reality of his situation. Her brother had always been trusting to a fault, quick to believe in other people's good intentions even when evidence suggested otherwise. It was one of his most endearing qualities, and also one of his most dangerous. "The investment opportunity was fake," Sarah said, as gently as she could. "There's no acquisition, no guaranteed returns, and probably no legitimate business at all. Raj has been running what's essentially a family and friends Ponzi scheme, using new investments to pay fake returns to earlier investors while skimming money off the top for his personal expenses." Mo stared at the documentation as if it might rearrange itself into a more acceptable truth. "But he sent us official paperwork, investment contracts with legal language and everything." "Legal language doesn't mean legal documents," Sarah explained. "Anyone can create professional-looking paperwork with a computer and a printer. The question is whether the documents represent actual legal agreements with real companies." Priya had gone very quiet, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "How much trouble are we in?" "Well," Sarah said, "you've given $5,000 to someone who's probably never going to pay it back, and you've done it using a credit card cash advance that charges 23% annual interest. If you make only minimum payments, you'll end up paying roughly $15,000 total over the next several years." The number hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, visible evidence of destruction that had already occurred but was only now being recognized.
Mo put his head in his hands, and Sarah could see his shoulders shaking with the effort of containing emotions he couldn't afford to express in front of his wife. "We're screwed," he said finally, his voice muffled by his palms. "We're completely and totally screwed." "No, you're not, because I'm going to help you." Both Mo and Priya looked up at her with the desperate hope of drowning people who'd just been thrown a life preserver. But Sarah wasn't finished with her revelations. "The thing is," she continued, "I haven't been entirely honest with you about my lottery win. When I said I'd won something, I was being deliberately vague because I was scared about how the truth might change things between us." Mo's expression shifted from hope to confusion. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone, opening the Lottery Commission's email that confirmed my jackpot win. I didn't win a few $1,000s. I won the entire jackpot, $27 million. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the sound of children playing in the courtyard outside. Mo and Priya stared at me as if I'd announced I was actually an alien visitor from another planet. $27 million, Priya repeated slowly, as if testing the words for accuracy. Million, with an M. With an M, I confirmed. After taxes, it works out to roughly 16 million, give or take a few $100,000. Mo was shaking his head back and forth like a broken toy. "You've had this information for 3 weeks? You've known you won $27 million and you didn't tell us?" "I was trying to figure out how to handle it. Do you have any idea how complicated sudden wealth is? How many families it destroys? How many people lose relationships and make terrible decisions and end up worse off than they started?"
"But you could have prevented this whole mess," Mo said, his voice rising. "You could have stopped us from making the worst financial decision of our lives. You could have just told us the truth. If I'd told you the truth, would you have been calling me for help instead of calling me as family?" Sarah shot back. "Would you have been excited to see your sister, or excited to see your sister's bank account?" The question hit its target, and Mo flinched as if she'd slapped him. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Sarah pulled up one of the articles she'd bookmarked on her phone. "Listen to this. Family relationships are often the first casualty of lottery wins. Relatives who previously treated winners as equals begin to view them as resources to be managed rather than people to be loved." This is from a therapist who specializes in working with lottery winners. Priya was crying now, quiet tears that tracked through her makeup and dripped onto the printouts scattered across the table. "I can't believe we did this. I can't believe we risked our family's financial security on someone we barely know." "But that's exactly why I couldn't tell you," Sarah said, her own voice breaking with emotion. "Because you were willing to risk everything based on hope and desperation. What happens when you know your sister has more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes? What happens to your judgment when the safety net is that big?" Mo stood up abruptly and began pacing the small living room, his movements sharp and agitated. "So what now? You write us a check and we pretend this never happened? You pay off our credit cards and buy us a house and turn us into your charity cases?" "I don't know. I honestly don't know what happens now." Jake's key turned in the front door lock. He was home from school, probably expecting his usual after-school snack and help with homework. Instead, he walked into a living room where his parents and aunt were crying and shouting and dealing with adult problems that had no easy solutions. "Why is everyone sad?" he asked, dropping his backpack by the door with the casual confidence of a child who'd always believed his home was a safe place where problems got solved by grown-ups who knew what they were doing. Priya wiped her eyes and summoned a smile that was heartbreaking in its determination to protect her son from their crisis. "We're not sad, sweetheart. We're just having a complicated conversation about grown-up stuff." But Jake had spent 8 years learning to read the emotional weather in his household, and he wasn't fooled by his mother's performance. He looked from face to face, processing information with the intuitive intelligence that children develop when they live with stress they can't control.
Are we going to have to move again? He asked quietly. The question broke something in Mo's chest, and he knelt down to pull his son into a fierce hug. No, buddy, we're not going to have to move. Everything's going to be okay. Promise? Mo looked over Jake's head at Sarah, and she saw a lifetime of love and desperation and hope in his eyes. I promise, he said. And Sarah understood that she had just become responsible for making sure he could keep that promise without destroying his dignity in the process. After Jake had been settled with snacks and cartoon shows, the three adults reconvened around the dining room table. But the dynamic had shifted fundamentally in the past hour. Sarah was no longer the helpful sister who might lend a hand during emergencies. She was the person with the power to solve every problem permanently, and that change had altered the gravitational pull of their entire relationship. I need to understand something, Sarah said carefully. If I help you with this, if I pay off the credit card and make sure you don't suffer any consequences from Raj's fraud, what happens the next time you face a financial emergency? What happens when Jake needs something for school, or your car breaks down, or your rent goes up?
Mo and Priya exchanged a look that contained entire conversations about pride and practicality and the mathematics of maintaining dignity when your sister could buy and sell small countries. I don't know, Mo said finally. I've never had to figure out how to be related to someone with $27 million. Neither have I, Sarah admitted, and that's what scares me. I love you both so much, and I love Jake more than my own life. But I also know that money changes things, whether you want it to or not. And I don't want to wake up 5 years from now and discover that I've turned you into people who expect me to solve every problem with my checkbook. What if we sign something? Priya suggested tentatively. Some kind of agreement that says you'll help us this one time, and then we go back to being regular family members who don't ask for money. Sarah almost laughed at the innocence of the suggestion. Do you really think a piece of paper could prevent you from calling me if Jake needed emergency medical treatment you couldn't afford? Do you think you'd choose pride over your child's welfare? No, Priya said quietly, I wouldn't. And I wouldn't want you to, Sarah continued. That's the impossible part of this situation. I have the resources to ensure that Jake never lacks for anything he needs, and you have the parental instinct to use every available resource to protect your child. How do we navigate that without fundamentally changing who we are to each other? Mo had stopped pacing and was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands again. Maybe we can't, he said. Maybe this changes everything whether we want it to or not. The admission hung between them like a bridge they weren't sure they were ready to cross. Sarah had spent 3 weeks trying to figure out how to manage her windfall without damaging her relationships, but she was beginning to understand that some changes were inevitable, regardless of how carefully she tried to control them. There's something else, she said, pulling out another document she'd prepared that morning. I've been researching what it means to give away large amounts of money. There are tax implications and legal requirements and all kinds of bureaucratic complications that affect both the giver and the receiver. She explained gift taxes and annual limits, the difference between loans and gifts, the importance of proper documentation and legal oversight. Mo and Priya listened with the overwhelmed expressions of people trying to process information that belonged to a world they'd never expected to inhabit. The bottom line, Sarah concluded, is that helping you isn't as simple as writing a check. If I pay off your credit card debt, it counts as a taxable gift that you'll need to report to the IRS. If I give you money for Jake's college fund, there are annual limits on how much I can contribute without triggering additional taxes and paperwork. So even your generosity is complicated? Mo observed with bitter humor. Everything about this is complicated, Sarah agreed.
That's why I've been paralyzed for 3 weeks, trying to figure out how to do the right thing when I'm not even sure what the right thing is. Priya's phone buzzed with a reminder that she needed to leave for work in 10 minutes. She looked at the alert with the distant confusion of someone whose ordinary concerns had been eclipsed by much larger problems. "I have to call in sick," she said. "I can't go to work and pretend to care about dental insurance and appointment scheduling when our entire life just got turned upside down." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You should go to work. You should maintain your normal routine while we figure this out. Because whatever we decide to do about the money, you're still going to need your job and your regular life and your sense of identity outside of this crisis." Priya looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's tone convinced her to gather her purse and keys. She kissed Mo goodbye with the automatic affection of people who'd learned to maintain love even during stress, and hugged Sarah with an intensity that spoke of gratitude and confusion and fear. "I don't know how to thank you. I don't even know if I should thank you, but I'm glad we know the truth now." After Priya left, Mo and Sarah sat in the living room while Jake watched cartoons and worked on his homework at the dining room table. The afternoon light filtered through windows that needed
Cleaning, casting everything in a golden haze that made the apartment look more hopeful than it had any right to. "I need to ask you something," Mo said quietly, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." Sarah nodded, bracing herself for whatever question had been building behind his careful composure. "Are you going to leave?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you going to take your money and move somewhere else and start a new life where you don't have to deal with relatives who make terrible financial decisions and put you in impossible positions?" The question revealed fears Sarah hadn't fully considered, implications of her wealth that extended beyond gift taxes and family dynamics, into the fundamental question of whether she'd remain the same person in the same place with the same relationships. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've thought about it. There are days when the idea of starting over somewhere no one knows my history feels incredibly appealing. But this is my home. You're my family. The community center where I work serves kids who need advocates, and I understand their situation in ways that rich people usually don't. I'm not sure I want to give up my connection to the life I've built just because I can afford to live differently." Mo was quiet for several minutes, processing her answer and its implications. "What if we moved instead?" "What?" "What if Priya and Jake and I relocated somewhere else? Got a fresh start where we weren't constantly reminded of the disparity between our financial situations? Would that make it easier for you to help us without feeling like you were fundamentally changing our relationship?" Sarah felt something crack open in her chest at the generosity of his suggestion. Mo was offering to give up his own support networks and familiarity to make her life easier, to remove the ongoing temptation for financial dependence by removing himself from her daily orbit. "You would do that?" "I would do anything to protect my family," Mo said simply. "And right now, protecting my family might mean protecting them from becoming too dependent on your generosity." They sat together in comfortable silence while Jake's cartoons provided background noise and the afternoon light shifted across the carpet. Sarah thought about all the lottery winner stories she'd researched, all the families torn apart by money and expectation and the complicated mathematics of sudden wealth. But she also thought about Jake asking if dragons were real, about Mo teaching her to ride a bicycle in a parking lot 25 years ago, about the way Priya had thanked her for dinner with genuine warmth despite their financial stress. These were good people who'd made one terrible decision based on desperation and hope. They deserved better than being destroyed by someone else's fraud and their own poor judgment. "I have an idea," Sarah said, finally. "It's complicated, and it might not work, but it's the only solution I can think of that protects everyone's dignity while still solving the immediate problem."
Mo looked at her with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to hope too much, but couldn't quite stop himself from hoping anyway. I'm listening. Sarah's idea required 3 lawyers, 2 financial advisors, an accountant, and 6 weeks of paperwork that made tax returns look like grocery lists. But by mid-December, the Chen Family Financial Security Foundation existed as a legal entity with its own bank account, board of directors, and mission statement that had taken her 12 drafts to perfect.
The foundation's purpose was elegant in its simplicity: to provide financial education, emergency assistance, and long-term stability planning for families navigating economic hardship in their community. Sarah served as the founding donor and board chair, but the foundation's day-to-day operations would be managed by a professional staff that included social workers, financial counselors, and community advocates who understood the difference between charity and empowerment. Mo became the foundation's first program coordinator, a position that came with a salary competitive with his old marketing job and benefits comprehensive enough to ensure his family's basic security. His role involved identifying families in need, developing individualized support plans, and overseeing the implementation of services that ranged from emergency grants to financial literacy workshops to small business development loans. Priya joined as the foundation's family advocate, working part-time while maintaining her position at the dental office. Her job involved conducting intake interviews with potential beneficiaries, helping them navigate available resources, and providing ongoing support to ensure that financial assistance translated into sustainable improvements in their lives. The beauty of the arrangement was that it transformed Mo and Priya from recipients of Sarah's generosity into partners in her mission to address the systemic issues that had created their crisis in the first place. Instead of simply paying off their credit card debt, Sarah had created a structure that allowed them to earn the money they needed while contributing their skills and experience to helping other families avoid similar disasters. The foundation's first official act was to provide emergency financial assistance to the Morrison Chen family. Mo had hyphenated their name after marriage, including immediate payoff of their credit card debt and enrollment in a comprehensive financial literacy program designed to prevent future crises. But the assistance came with requirements. Both Mo and Priya had to complete 40 hours of financial education, participate in monthly counseling sessions, and demonstrate progress toward long-term stability goals they'd developed with their assigned caseworker. The process was deliberately thorough and occasionally uncomfortable, designed to ensure that the foundation's help created lasting change rather than temporary relief. Mo chafed at some of the requirements, particularly the monthly check-ins that felt intrusive to someone who'd never had to account for his financial decisions to anyone except his wife. But Sarah held firm, understanding that dignity was sometimes built through structure rather than charity. The goal isn't to make this easy, she explained during one of their foundation board meetings, held in the conference room of the legal office that had helped establish the organization. The goal is to make it effective. If we just write checks without requiring accountability, we're not helping families build better lives, we're just enabling them to continue making the same mistakes with more resources. The board meetings had become Sarah's favorite part of the foundation's work. The other board members included Marcus from the Community Center, Mrs. Rodriguez from Sarah's former job, Dr. Elizabeth Santos from the local university's social work program, and Janet Williams, a financial advisor who specialized in working with low-income families. Together, they'd developed policies and procedures that balanced compassion with practical effectiveness, creating a model that other communities had already begun to replicate. Jake's reaction to the changes in his family's circumstances had been pragmatically straightforward in the way that only children could manage. His parents had new jobs that made them less stressed and more available for homework help and bedtime stories. Their apartment was the same, but the constant undertone of financial anxiety had disappeared, replaced by a stability that allowed for planning beyond the next paycheck. "Aunt Sassy," he said during one of their Saturday afternoon visits to the park that they'd claimed for their weekly ritual, "Mom says you're like a fairy godmother who helps families with money problems." Sarah laughed, pushing him higher on the swing set that they'd claimed for their weekly ritual. "What do you think about that?"
I think fairy godmothers are supposed to be old ladies with wands, not regular people with laptops. But I guess magic comes in different ships. Jake's 8-year-old wisdom never failed to surprise her. Are you going to help other kids whose families are worried about money? That's the plan, Sarah said. Your dad and mom are going to help me figure out how to do it right. Good, Jake said, with the matter-of-fact certainty that had made him such an effective tree in his school play. Everyone should have enough money for the important stuff.
The community response to the foundation had exceeded Sarah's most optimistic projections. Within 2 months of opening, they'd received over 400 applications for assistance, ranging from families needing help with emergency medical bills to single mothers seeking support for job training programs. The volume of need was simultaneously heartbreaking and energizing, proof that Mo and Priya's financial crisis had been just one example of a much larger problem that required systematic solutions. Sarah had hired Dr. Santos as the foundation's executive director, a decision that allowed her to remain involved in strategic planning while delegating the operational complexities to someone with decades of experience in community development. Dr. Santos brought both expertise and credibility to the foundation's work, helping establish partnerships with local social service agencies, educational institutions, and healthcare providers. What you've created here, Dr. Santos told Sarah during one of their monthly planning sessions, is a model for how wealthy individuals can engage in community support without perpetuating dependency or creating power imbalances that undermine the dignity of the people they're trying to help. The comment had sparked a conversation about Sarah's long-term vision for the foundation and her role in its future development. She had initially planned to maintain a low profile, contributing funds while letting others manage the public-facing aspects of the work, but as the foundation's impact became visible throughout the community, Sarah found herself increasingly comfortable with a more active leadership role. Part of her transformation had been facilitated by the financial advisor she'd finally hired, a woman named Rebecca Torres, who specialized in working with lottery winners and inheritance recipients. Rebecca had helped Sarah develop a comprehensive plan for managing her wealth that included tax-efficient giving strategies, long-term investment planning, and personal financial security measures. The thing about sudden wealth, Rebecca had explained during their first meeting, is that it requires you to think in timescales that most people never have to consider. You're not just planning for your own lifetime, you're making decisions that could affect your family and community for generations. Under Rebecca's guidance, Sarah had structured her giving to maximize both impact and sustainability. The foundation received an annual allocation that would allow it to operate in perpetuity, while separate funds had been established for education, healthcare, and housing initiatives. Sarah had also created a personal emergency fund that could handle any family crisis that might arise, ensuring that future assistance wouldn't require her to dip into the foundation's resources. The most difficult conversation had been with Mo about his salary and the long-term financial security that his foundation's position provided. Sarah had wanted to ensure that his compensation was fair and sustainable, but she'd also wanted to avoid creating a situation where her brother felt permanently indebted to her generosity. "I need you to understand something," she'd told him during a private dinner at his apartment 6 months after the foundation's launch. "This job isn't charity. You're qualified for this position. You're excellent at this work, and the foundation needs someone with your skills and experience. The fact that you're my sister is relevant to how we got here, but it's not relevant to whether you deserve this opportunity." Mo had listened with the careful attention he'd learned to bring to conversations about money and family dynamics. "But if you weren't my sister, would I have gotten this job?" "If I weren't your sister, this job wouldn't exist," Sarah pointed out. "But that doesn't make your qualifications any less real or your contributions any less valuable." The distinction mattered more than Sarah had initially realized. Mo needed to feel like he was earning his family's security rather than simply receiving it, and the foundation's structure allowed him to contribute meaningfully to something larger than his own financial stability. His work identifying and assisting other families in crisis had given him a sense of purpose that went beyond his paycheck.
Priya's transformation had been equally significant, but more subtle. Her role as family advocate had revealed natural talents for listening and problem-solving that her dental office job had never fully utilized. She'd discovered that she had an intuitive understanding of how to help people navigate bureaucratic systems and access available resources, skills that had been developed through years of managing her own family's financial challenges. "I never thought of our struggles as preparation for anything," Priya had confided to Sarah during one of their monthly coffee meetings. But it turns out that understanding what it feels like to choose between paying rent and buying groceries makes me better at helping other families who are facing those same impossible decisions. The foundation's success had attracted attention from other lottery winners and wealthy individuals interested in replicating its model. Sarah had been invited to speak at conferences about wealth management and community development, opportunities that had initially terrified her but gradually become sources of satisfaction and expertise. The traditional model of philanthropy, she'd told an audience of financial advisors at a regional conference, assumes that wealthy people know what poor people need and that money alone can solve complex social problems. What we've learned is that the people experiencing financial hardship usually understand their situation better than outsiders do. Our job isn't to impose solutions, it's to provide resources and support that allow families to implement their own solutions. The speech had been recorded and shared online, leading to speaking engagements at universities and nonprofit organizations across the region. Sarah had discovered that she enjoyed public speaking more than she'd expected, particularly when she could focus on practical strategies rather than personal details about her lottery win. Meanwhile, the investigation into Raj's fraudulent investment scheme had expanded beyond Mo and Priya's case to include dozens of other victims across multiple states. Sarah had hired a private investigator to document the extent of Raj's deception, and the evidence had been turned over to federal authorities who were building a case for mail fraud and securities violations. The good news, Sarah's lawyer had explained during a recent update meeting, is that Raj will likely face significant criminal charges and civil penalties. The bad news is that he's spent most of the money he collected, so victim restitution will probably be minimal. Mo had taken the news with equanimity that surprised everyone, including himself. "A year ago, losing that $5,000 would have destroyed us," he'd said. "Now it's just a reminder of how lucky we are that Sarah was able to turn our disaster into something productive." The perspective shift had been one of the most significant changes in Mo's worldview. Instead of seeing himself as a victim of Raj's fraud or a charity case dependent on his sister's generosity, he'd begun to understand his experience as part of a larger pattern of economic vulnerability that affected thousands of families in their community. By the Foundation's first anniversary, they'd assisted over 150 families with everything from emergency rent payments to small business loans to college preparation programs. The success stories were varied and meaningful. A single mother who'd used Foundation support to complete nursing school and triple her income. A family who'd received help with a down payment and purchased their first home. A teenager who'd received college preparation tutoring and earned a full scholarship to State University. But the Foundation's impact extended beyond individual success stories to broader changes in how the community approached financial hardship and resource allocation. Local banks had developed new products for low-income customers based on the Foundation's research into predatory lending practices. The school district had implemented financial literacy curricula that taught students practical money management skills. Social service agencies had adopted the Foundation's family-centered approach to assistance that emphasized dignity and self-determination. "What you've created," Dr. Santos had told Sarah during their anniversary celebration, "is a model for how communities can address systemic poverty without perpetuating the power imbalances that often make assistance programs ineffective." Sarah had looked around the room at the Foundation's staff, board members, and beneficiaries who'd gathered to celebrate a year of work that had exceeded everyone's expectations. Mo was leading a workshop on budgeting for young families. His expertise, born from years of financial struggle, transformed into professional competence. Priya was counseling a teenage mother about college options, her own experience navigating parenthood and financial hardship, providing credibility that no amount of professional training could match. Jake was in the corner with several other children, working on art projects that would be displayed in the Foundation's lobby. His purple castle had evolved into an entire fantasy kingdom where dragons helped families solve their problems and fairy godmothers looked like regular people with laptops.
The scene represented everything Sarah had hoped to achieve when she'd first conceived of the foundation, a community where financial hardship was addressed through empowerment rather than charity, where people who'd experienced challenges became resources for others facing similar struggles, where wealth was used to create opportunity rather than dependency. But the personal transformation had been equally significant. Sarah had discovered that having $27 million was less important than knowing how to use $27 million in ways that aligned with her values and strengthened her relationships rather than complicating them. The community center where she'd worked still occupied a special place in her heart and her schedule. Sarah had funded renovations that expanded the facility and hired additional staff, but she'd also maintained her role as a volunteer tutor and mentor. The children she worked with knew her as Miss Sarah, who helped with homework and mediated playground disputes, not as the wealthy woman whose foundation had improved their family's financial circumstances. The goal, she had explained to Rebecca during one of their quarterly financial reviews, is for the money to make life better without making me a different person. I want to be generous without becoming defined by my generosity. I want to help without becoming someone that people can't relate to. The balance was delicate and required constant attention. Sarah had learned to recognize the subtle ways that wealth could isolate her from the community she wanted to serve, and she developed strategies for maintaining authentic relationships that weren't shaped primarily by financial considerations. One of those strategies involved maintaining her original apartment and her modest personal lifestyle, despite having the resources to afford any luxury she could imagine. Sarah had upgraded a few things: better furniture, a more reliable car, a vacation to Ireland where she'd finally visited her great-grandmother's village. But she'd resisted the temptation to let her spending reflect her full financial capacity. I've seen too many lottery winners who changed their entire lives overnight and then spent years trying to figure out who they were supposed to be, she'd told Mo during one of their weekly family dinners. I'd rather change the world around me while staying anchored to the person I was before the money. The approach had preserved relationships and community connections that might otherwise have been strained by the dramatic shift in her financial circumstances. Her neighbors still waved to her in the hallway, her former coworkers still invited her to birthday parties and retirement celebrations, and the children at the community center still hugged her legs when they saw her approaching with art supplies and afternoon snacks. As the foundation entered its second year, Sarah was already planning expansions that would extend its reach beyond their immediate community. She'd received inquiries from organizations in other cities interested in replicating the foundation's model, and she was developing a toolkit that would allow other communities to adapt their approach to local needs and resources. The thing about sustainable change, Dr. Santis had observed during one of their recent strategy meetings, is that it has to be designed to outlast its founders. The best thing we can do is create systems that work so well that other people want to copy them. Sarah had nodded, understanding that the foundation's long-term success would be measured not just by the families they helped directly, but by the broader changes they inspired in how communities approached poverty and wealth redistribution.
But on a personal level, the Foundation's most important achievement had been the preservation and strengthening of family relationships that could easily have been damaged by the sudden introduction of vast wealth. Mo and Priya had found meaningful work that utilized their skills and experiences while providing the financial security their family needed. Jake was growing up in a household where money was a tool for helping others rather than a source of stress or shame. And Sarah had discovered that being wealthy was less important than being wise about wealth. That having $27 million meant nothing unless she could figure out how to use it in ways that created more justice and opportunity in the world around her. And that's where we'll leave Sarah Chen, surrounded by the community she helped build, proof that sometimes the most transformative thing about winning the lottery isn't the money itself, but learning how to use it wisely. Sarah's story reminds us that wealth without wisdom can destroy relationships, but wealth guided by love and community-mindedness can transform entire neighborhoods. She didn't just solve her brother's financial crisis, she created a model for how families can navigate sudden changes in fortune without losing what matters most.
If you enjoyed this story about family, money, and the complex art of helping without hurting, I'd love to have you join our community of listeners. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode, and if this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. We're building something special here, a space where we explore the messy, beautiful reality of human relationships and the choices that define us. Your support helps us keep telling these stories that matter. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most powerful magic looks like ordinary people making extraordinary choices for the people they love. Thanks for listening.